Accidental Marriage by Shadina. Chapter 9. As was becoming customary, Ed woke up to see his commanding officer's sleeping face. It wasn't all that bad. He did have a pretty face. His skin was all smooth and clean, like the man had never had problems with acne. His dark hair was a nice contrast to his pale skin, and while he had certain feminine aspects to his face and even body, he was very much male, and it showed too. His eyes focused in on Roy's lips. They had felt firm against his own last night. He couldn't help but press 2 fingers against his own mouth as he remembered it, as if trying to relive the experience. Then he just felt stupid. He looked back at Roy. Why pretend when he could actually relive it? After all, apparently Roy wanted it too. He craned his neck some and managed to plant his lips against Roy's. He still tasted like the wine, but it was mixed with morning breath. Really not a good combination. But Ed kept his lips firmly against Roy's. He thought back to how Roy kissed him. He had slipped some alcohol into his mouth. Touched him. Touch okay. Ed shifted a bit so he was fully under Roy, never removing his mouth. He started sliding his hand under Roy's shirt, but stopped. He had been staring at Roy's ass since the night he had gotten drunk. His hands moved to cup the 2 firm cheeks. Okay, so now he was touching. What was next? Oh yes, tongue. He was about to try and get his tongue in Roy's mouth when he realized that he was staring up into dark charcoal eyes that did not look happy with him. Ed froze completely, and the grip on Roy's ass was becoming almost painful for the brunette. He was certainly going to have bruises, especially the one its automail hand had a firm grip on. Roy pulled away from the boy's mouth. Let go. Roy swore he heard Ed whimper before releasing the painful grip he had on his ass. Roy removed himself from Ed the moment he was able to and winced at the pain from his ass because of Ed's hands. Really, Edward, I'm not interested. Just because we're married doesn't mean you get to try and experiment with me because your hormones are crazy. Ed frowned. Hey, it's your fault too. You're the one that trapped me last night. Where the hell do you get off kissing me and then falling asleep, you lazy bastard? He demanded. Roy stopped and stared at him for a moment, remembering last night very clearly. Ed had wanted to try the wine Roy had ordered, but he wouldn't let him. Then he got it in his head that he should slip Ed some from his mouth and kiss him. As he thought more about it, it became even more disturbing because Ed had wanted it. It showed in the kiss. Ed wanted what was happening, and Roy was more than willing to give it to him. If he hadn't passed out, then he would have gone a lot further than he did with the 16-year-old boy. A lot further than he should with a 16-year-old boy. It was because he hadn't been with a woman in a long time. That had to be it. There was really no other explanation for his insanity yesterday. I wasn't thinking properly last night, he said. He couldn't have been. He was a ladies' man, but he wasn't that loose. He looked at Ed's gold eyes that were staring at him expectantly. I can't do this. He got up suddenly and went to gather his things, ignoring the pounding in his head. It wasn't going to kill him. Ed watched as the dark-haired male suddenly walked away, trying to figure out what was going on, and frowned when he saw Roy packing up. What are you doing? He asked him. Roy had his suitcase opened and was dumping his clothing and other belongings. I'm packing, he said. Obviously this place has gotten to me because I nearly... He stopped, not wanting to say anything more. I'll send for your brother, and the 2 of you can enjoy the rest of the nights that we paid for, he said, and frowned a bit. You're running away, he stated bluntly. I am not. Roy huffed. Yes, you are. Why? Just because we kissed? Are you saying I'm too small to have a kiss? He huffed, red-faced. Roy stopped. Yes. You are too young. You're too young for me. You're too young for this joke. That's what it was, a joke. And married to a male 14 years his junior. It was a joke. You'll get over it, he said when he noticed the hurt look on Ed's face. The boy would get over it. It was just pent-up frustrated hormones and nothing more between both of them. He didn't say anything else, thankful for Ed's uncommon silence as he worked to leave as quickly as possible. Ed didn't even move after the door closed and Roy was gone, leaving him behind. He'd get over it, that's what Roy said. Hormones. Was that all this was? Ed had never been in this situation before, and thus had no idea what to think or what to believe. He really hoped Roy would send his brother, because he needed him right now. Even if he wouldn't tell his brother what was going on, he just wanted someone that cared about him at this point. Roy was home in his freaking huge house, as Ed often referred to it, a small glass in his hands and a long-since-empty bottle on the table. His eyes were closed, and he was slouched forward. He just needed to find a woman, have sex with her, and his problem would be solved. Maybe not Ed's, but he'd be fine. At the same time, he wasn't all that interested in finding a woman to have meaningless sex with. He didn't feel like doing much of anything. He sighed. Al should be there with Ed by now, so both of them should be fine. He recalled the look of hurt on Ed's face and groaned. That sort of just proved it for him. Ed did have a crush on him. For a genius, that boy was pretty stupid. He set the glass on the table and laid back onto the couch. He rubbed his face with his hands, completely worn out by the situation already. Ed and Al had come back a week later. Roy and Ed hadn't even looked at each other, much less exchanged more than a sentence here or there. It bothered Al. Hell, it bothered Roy and Ed, but nothing could be done about it. Roy was going to be heading back to work the next day, and he was very happy about that, hoping that would relieve some of the tension. That evening, however, he got a phone call from his own commanding officer. It was in the middle of dinner, too. Ed and Al listened in, though it didn't make much sense. Mostly just yes sirs, which was kind of odd to hear from Mustang. It was easy to forget that even Roy had someone he answered to. Roy hung up the phone, and heading back to dinner, he took several bites not saying anything, and Ed figured it had nothing to do with them, though he was curious about what it was about. After about 5 or so bites, Roy finally spoke up. "I've been given an assignment." Ed perked up. He didn't know that Roy went on missions himself. He thought he was more of a command base and sent his underlings, such as Ed, much to his own dismay, and would never admit to being. "I've been told to go with a partner of my own discretion, thus you'll be going with me," he told Ed. "I'll have Hawkeye come over tomorrow to help you prepare," he said. That had Ed very curious as to what exactly he was preparing for. "Why the hell do I need Hawkeye? I've gone on plenty of missions, just me and Al. I know what to do. In fact, why don't you just sit at home and let us do it? That way, he'd get paid, and he'd pay off more of the damn building so he could get out of here sooner. We'd get it done a hell of a lot sooner than you would." Roy couldn't help but roll his eyes. "Because I'd be afraid to see what the expense report would look like if I let you do that." Ed pounded the table. "What was that?" he demanded. "Ed, let's not add the cost of the table to our accumulating bill," he said flatly. "Maybe I want to destroy your damn table," he growled. "I doubt that. You'll want to get out of the house, don't you? Get your own place." Ed sat back down, folding his arms over his desk, grumbling, saying something about how he'd just wait until he had a place, then break the bastard's table. He looked up when Roy stood up, holding his now mostly empty plate. "Go to sleep, Ed. Hawkeye likes to be punctual," he told him. He put the plate in the sink, figuring it would give him something to do tomorrow, or Al, whoever got to them first. He then headed up to his own room. "Bastard, it didn't even tell me what the damn mission is," he said, irritated. "I bet he did that on purpose." "Brother, maybe he couldn't tell you yet is all. I'm sure you'll find out soon enough," he said. Ed didn't say anything, much to his surprise. He just stared at where the older male had left. Al sighed a bit. When he had gone to his brother in Long Beach, he wasn't sure what to expect. Well, it kind of did. The irrational breathing fire, Ed, but instead he found a contemplating one? Did that even make sense? That entire week, Ed seemed to always be deep in thought, but he didn't share with his brother what it was about. Obviously, it had something to do with the Colonel, but what? Neither of them had been willing to part any information about what had taken place, but he knew there had been a shift in their relationship. Roy was practically avoiding Ed and saying things very carefully, like he cared how Ed would take it. While Ed, he seemed to be more patient with Roy, not blowing up as quickly or loudly as before the trip. He had never seen his brother this way, not with his commanding officer anyways. Something definitely happened, and maybe even a few things. Hawkeye arrived early in the morning, as Roy suspected she would. She carried a duffel bag over her shoulder and was in her blues, apparently planning on heading to the office once she was done here. Riza had been to his house a few times, so she was the only one he felt he could trust to come over, that and they'd need her feminine advice, if she was capable of offering such. Sometimes Roy wondered. Roy let her in, offering her some coffee, explaining that Ed was still waking up and had been doing so for over an hour. Riza accepted the offer, and the two friends sat down and did some small talk. When Riza had finished her cup, she decided she'd waited long enough and went to head upstairs. She looked at Roy with a raised eyebrow when she found out what room he was staying in, but Roy offered no allowances for further comments on the matter. Riza opened the door without knocking and saw the rumpled blankets and a random limp here and there, with a knot of yellow hair somewhere in there. She shook her head. So this was waking up for him? Riza took the water off the nightstand and dumped it on Edward, where she suspected his head was. Ed sputtered as he sat up, his hair dripping water down his nose and cheeks. His gold eyes wide as he looked at Riza, who was setting down the now empty cup onto the nightstand. She turned to look at him. "Roy told you that I was coming over this morning," she said. "It's rather rude to still be sleeping when I was here nearly half an hour ago." Ed couldn't say anything to that. What would he say? This was Hawkeye, after all, a sharpshooter, and always had a gun on her. He gulped a bit. "Sorry," he apologized. Riza lifted up a large blue and black duffel bag, dumping it onto the bed. "We have work to do," she said. "Go shower so we can get started." Ed nodded his head and got up to do so, wondering exactly what kind of work he had to do with Riza. He made his shower real quick, just so he could satisfy his curiosity that much faster. He walked out, dressed his hair in the usual braid, though it was now wet. Riza frowned. "Take your hair out of the braid. You don't want it to dry like that," she told him. Ed gave her a strange look, but did as he was told. "So, what are we doing?" he asked her slowly. She looked at him strangely. "Preparing you for the mission." "Right, of course. Why didn't I think of that? What exactly is this mission that I need to be prepared for?" he asked, frowning. Riza returned the frown. "The Colonel didn't tell you?" she asked as Edward unzipped the bag to look inside. "No, he hasn't said a goddamn thing to me about it other than—" Ed stopped and stared at the bag's contents. "Why are there women's clothes in this bag?" he demanded. Normally, he just assumed that they would be her clothes that she was just carrying around for one reason or another, but this was Hawkeye. She didn't do things like that. "That's part of your mission," Riza stated bluntly. Ed looked red-faced and angry. "Bastard!" he yelled at the top of his lungs and ran out of the room to strangle the dark-haired man on the couch in the living room. "It's Colonel Bastard," he answered. Ed stopped short from strangling him and pointed a finger at him, his stance wide, and he was visibly shaking. He was so mad. "Hawkeye, you... I'm not doing it! I refuse! There's no freaking way I'm doing this!" he yelled. Roy frowned. "So you'd rather I brought a woman on a mission like this?" "Yes! If the mission requires women's clothes, then they should be on a woman!" Roy sighed and put his coffee down. "I would normally do so, however, the person I'm going after, it would be best if I don't bring a real female in case things go wrong," he said. Ed deflated a bit. "What do you mean? Who are you going after?" "A serial killer and rapist," he answered. "We're going to see Cole's Couples Festival. I suspect that he'll strike there next. I'm taking you because I know you can look the part, and you can protect yourself should it be necessary." Ed didn't say anything for a moment. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked a bit on the grumpy side because of all of this. "You'd make a better woman than I would. You have a prettier face." "Excuse me?" Roy frowned. "You heard what I said." He huffed. "Now I gotta go upstairs before Hawkeye gets mad for making her wait again." Ed turned and headed up the stairs. He agreed with Roy. It certainly wasn't a mission to bring a woman on if they could at all help it. He just hated the fact he had to be the one dressed up. It would look a little weird if Roy dressed up, because then his date would be taller. He opened the door and stepped inside the room he had claimed as his and saw a few outfits laid out on the bed. He groaned and closed the door, sealing his fate with women's clothes. "I'm not wearing that," he said, glaring at the offensive object Riza held in her hand. "Really, Edward, it's not a big deal. What other choice do you have? You'd look ridiculous without it." "I'd look ridiculous with it, you mean?" he glared. "No, you'll look like a little girl without it," she argued with him. "Who are you calling so small that without a stuffed bra could pass as a small girl?" he demanded. He paused and frowned. "Don't answer that!" "Didn't think you wanted me to," she said. "But really, Edward, how is this supposed to work if you don't cooperate?" "I am cooperating. I just refuse to wear that," he said, glaring at the offending object. Riza gave him an irritated look, and Ed thought she was going to shoot him, but that would be better than wearing a stuffed bra. It took longer than he'd hoped, but less time than he expected. He heard footsteps and looked up from his book and saw a girl. No, Ed. It was Ed, just with his hair down, some light makeup such as lip gloss, in a red and gold girl kimono. He looked beautiful, surprisingly. Ed fidgeted nervously under Roy's wide-eyed gaze. He blushed embarrassed and refused to look him in the eye. Under different circumstances, he'd probably would have enjoyed this more, well, the different circumstances being that he wasn't dressed like a girl.
Riza came down and moved over, pushing Roy's mouth closed. That made Roy come too. He cleared his throat, embarrassed. I'd hardly recognize him if I didn't know he was going to come down looking different.
Riza looked over at Ed. It wasn't too different. He was surprisingly compliant until it came to the bra. He refused to use it, so I had to come up with a different idea. I figured with your ethnicity, it wouldn't look all that strange for Ed to dress in a kimono, and it'll give the illustration that he has a chest. Just a small one, she said. Roy nodded his head. It certainly did.
So, you think this will work?
He asked Riza. She nodded her head. I think it will. Now I need to get back to the office. Ed, go change into something you can travel in. Just remember how I taught you to dress. If you need help, I'm sure between you and Roy, you'll be able to figure it out. He's undressed enough women. She said and went to leave.
That was uncalled for.
Roy huffed. He went to look at Ed, who was undressing right there in front of him. He blushed and looked away.
Do that in your room,
he said. Ed looked at him, almost down to his boxers. Just because I dressed like one doesn't mean I'm a woman, he huffed. We're both guys, so what does it matter? He grabbed the clothing and went upstairs to finish changing. Roy slumped into the couch, rubbing his head, wondering if this had been a good idea after all.